I've got two people next who are pretty well placed. I won't call them experts because apparently that word's banned now today. So I've got two people that are pretty well placed to talk to you about kind of what your next steps are. I've got James, who is Senior Marketing Manager at World Rugby, and a load of other things, to be honest. I'm not really sure when this bloke sleeps. And we've also got Lucinda, who is Head of Comms for CAFOD. So please give them a hand as they come up. And James, it looks like the microphone is right by you. So as I did with the last panel, I can't do you half as much justice as yourself in introducing yourself.
Yeah, so good morning, everyone. My name is James Swanson, pronouns he, him. As mentioned, Senior Marketing Manager for the Women's Rugby World Cup 2025, which is coming to England next year. The biggest moment for women's rugby globally, and it's a great privilege to be able to welcome it here to England. Day to day, obviously I'm overseeing elements relating to marketing and brand and how we position the tournament in the right way and how we are ensuring we're providing opportunities for women and girls. The other element of what we're doing from an ED&I perspective, which is really a golden thread of the work that we're doing more broadly, is, again, how are we reaching communities? How are we reflecting the sort of organically diverse audience which we see in the women's sports space, not just in rugby, but in football? How do we make sure that what we're putting out on social, what we're saying in our comms, really signals the fact that we are a naturally inclusive tournament and that we are representing the myriad of identities that support women's rugby but are part of this wonderful galvanising vehicle of women's sports as a whole?
Lovely, thank you. I mean, he's told you about 5% of what he does there, but there you go. Very modest. Lucinda, to you.
Hello, I'm Lucinda. I am Head of Communications at CAFOD. And CAFOD is one of the UK's largest international development charities. You've either really heard of them or you've never heard of them. And that's linked to whether or not mostly you went to a faith school, so it's a faith-based agency. We are one of 15 charities that make up the Disasters Emergency Committee, so we focus on humanitarian work, responding to emergencies like in Gaza, and long-term development. And my role is Head of Communications, so I oversee all of our media work, our social channels and digital work, our creative content, and our brand, and we've just refreshed the CAFOD brand. And CAFOD has been on a journey to, like many organisations over the recent years, to become an anti-racist organisation. And part of the work that we've been doing is to embed, therefore, anti-racist principles throughout all of our communications, which is relevant in terms of inclusion, i.e. you want to focus on how you are representing the totality of the market that you are targeting, but also, like lots of the international sector is grappling with the idea that lots of the racist stereotypes that people may hold in the UK, particularly about African communities, will be based on things that we've spent 60 to 70 years telling people, and the way that we have asked for help and the way that we have fundraised or tried to demonstrate the need has, then we get to 2020s and we're saying, gosh, where's all this white saviour narrative come from? Where do we think? So that's a big challenge for us in our work.
Yeah, lovely. And I guess sticking with you, obviously there you mentioned kind of those, addressing some of those racist narratives in your comms. So to go to the point of assessing that we had some of those themes of the break, how did you start the process and what advice have you got for kind of some of the people here that are beginning that journey?
So I think for us, we were fortunate in that we had the budget and we had the senior buy-in, which, as we all know, often links to the budget available. We were able to work with a great consultancy who helped us look with a very critical eye at our marketing and our communications outputs. And that's really valuable because it's really tough to mark your own homework. And especially as, we're a communications team of nearly 30 people. People don't work in international development for the money. they work in international development because they want to feel like they're doing some good. So that's tough for people to then grapple with and look at the work that they might have produced that we now recognise to be problematic. I would say to people who are starting out on that journey, I would look at how you can get, you may not have the budget for a consultant to come in and review all your materials and your outputs, but think about who within your organisation or kind of friends or partners from other organisations that can help you do that work of looking at what you've done and being that critical eye that can help give a different perspective on your outputs.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I think it's also kind of asking people with that lived experience. We can't all hold the lived experience of everybody that we're trying to reach, so it's where can I tap into the people that have the answers based on just what they've experienced themselves. You mentioned an interesting point. I'm going to skip a couple of questions, sorry Aisha. I'm going to skip forward a couple of questions and come to James, because he mentioned something really interesting last night, and Lucinda touched on something there around budget and securing budget, and Nick spoke about it as well, as often your ED&I initiatives, your kind of inclusive comms, get a small side budget to, whether it be to tick the box or whether it be to, we don't really have the focus on this, or this is more expensive or whatever. But you made some really nice points yesterday, so I hope you don't mind me picking up on them, on kind of how you go about, not necessarily tricking senior leaders, but speaking their language more so.
Yeah, we won't use the word trickery in this regard, but I think I've been in a really privileged position. As I say, I sit in the commercial side of sport, but as mentioned, the golden thread of ED&I is at the centre of what I do more broadly. I think when you're trying to launch initiatives, and again, the sports space is very nuanced, has a lot of traditions, not as far ahead as other parts of wider business in some regards, but the common thread that all sports have is their currency is emotion. I was saying this to people earlier on in the networking session, is the emotional connection, the affiliation people have with sports teams, of sports brands, of athletes is very unique. And how you navigate that is tricky, because it represents so many things to different people. And of course, senior leaders across the sports space are very conscious of their communities and tradition, and fighting that ongoing tension through innovation and tradition, and how you go about it the right way. The way that I've approached it, especially when you're looking to get buy-in from senior leadership, you know that they will be commercially driven. You've got CEOs, you've got COOs in the room. How are you using language that resonates with them to communicate the sort of the positive output of what is essentially social impact, ED&I impact, in a way that doesn't alienate them and keeps them on that journey, but you're mirroring the language which you know is going to resonate with them. So I've always positioned initiatives which I know drive significant change in a certain sport, really help us as a wider sports entity reach different spaces. And I talk about audience diversification. I talk about, how we can then align what we're doing with this initiative with our partners, which of course down the line will help when it comes to partnership renewals. Things which to them, they say, oh, this is a win-win, this is a no-brainer. For me, if I know how again it needs to be positioned, and how I would naturally talk about it with, again, people in this room who have naturally bought in, we know the role that inclusion plays, representation, all of those components. It's not the same for everyone. Everyone has their own experience and understanding. We can't change the makeup of senior leaderships or boards, but what we can do is bring them along, educate at the same time, and find a way that making sure that your initiative, it will deliver in the ways that has value to them, which might have a slightly different value for you. But if you're positioning in that way, it works for both parties. So but I think that hopefully reflects what our conversation at dinner was last night. But I'm able to pass in those scenarios and have a commercial concept which has an ED&I sort of centre, but sort of undercut with that sort of impact piece. And they're not necessarily aware that it's happening, but ultimately the output is overtly positive.
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting point, and I think it should hopefully speak to a lot of people in this room as they try and get that budget from X, Y, and Z person. It's thinking about what is this person's goal, and can I align my goal with their goal so that we have ultimately a joint goal. Lucinda, obviously you've had similar challenges in that realm. I don't know if you've got anything kind of to add on that, or if there's anything in terms of that process evolving at all for CAFOD.
So as I mentioned, we've been lucky that we've had very senior level buy-in. This was an organisational priority for us to embed anti-racist principles. I think in terms of the process evolving and keeping ahead of it, someone mentioned earlier, you need a broad church for this work. So you need to try and bring together a team from across the organisation of willing individuals. And I would stress that as well, because of course we need to be really careful that it's not the job of people, who come from ethnic minorities to do that emotional work unless they want to be involved. And it's also an element of, like I say, you're reviewing work that you've already done. You might be it might be very problematic and uncomfortable to look at some of the work you've done. So you need people from across the organisation, and to create that kind of space where people are up for those challenging conversations. But I think in terms of evolving the process, it's also recognising just that it's a process. And we had quite a few colleagues within CAFOD who, as we came to the point of putting together our kind of anti-racist comms principles that we'd be embedding, really wanted a checklist. And they really wanted like a list of, great, I'm going to do my work, and can you give me a list then of words I can say and words I can't say? And actually, no, we can't, because to do that, you basically outsource and kind of check out of your responsibility to think critically about what you're doing. So one of the things that's been evolving for us is recognising we will come up with these anti-racist comms principles and these inclusive principles, but they will change over time, and we have to recognise that and continually review that, and bring people with us, and also bring people with us across the organisation so that people understand, not just the senior leaders, all across. We're an organisation of hundreds of people in 40 different countries. What does it look like around the world, and how are you communicating that work as you go?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it goes to Peter's point as well, is we're talking about a journey here, but it's almost a journey with no destinations, because we should constantly be in these spaces to talk and learn about kind of what is kind of the next thing, and what is the thing that we're talking about now. And James, just to come to you as well. You mentioned earlier about kind of sports being a very ingrained thing for a lot of people. Have you faced resistance when making changes within the sports world? And I guess, if so, what were those challenges, and how would you advise people facing similar challenges to kind of help overcome them?
Yes, I think for anyone in the room, regardless of your industry, there's going to be challenges in this space. I think, as I mentioned, sport is very traditional, depending on which sport you're working in. I've been fortunate to work across tennis, rugby, basketball, ice hockey, to name a few. Each have their own particular nuance and degree of challenges. I think the example I would use is, and I referenced it as a previous answer, is that you need to recognise that a lot of these decisions and the buy-in will be made by individuals that will maybe come from a certain background and have their own knowledge base, and you've got to go about both educating and getting that advocacy at the same time. The ways that I've done that is sort of explaining the why initially first, and going via that route and explaining to them through storytelling. I think that there's certain parts of my work, and there's certain spaces which within the sort of wider society are quite divisive. I've done a lot of work in trans inclusion in sport, for example, spaces that lots of people, regardless of their seniority in the business, have very stark viewpoints on. And if I use the example of sort of the trans inclusion component within sport, it's often something that is spoken in the media and very divisively by certain media subsidiaries. I think we all know who they are. And there's a lot of mistruth out there. So that education piece is number one, how to go about challenging that misinformation, and people reference certain things and say, actually, that's not necessarily true. Can I ask you where you've read that? I would challenge you to maybe read some more diverse media. But the other component is bringing it back to the human level. And that's what I've done when I've sort of run conferences similar to this in the past on LGBTQ plus inclusion in the sports space, and making sure I get those senior leaders in. I have run a selection of panels with people from the trans community up on stage talking about their experience, and it humanizes things. They're no longer just a trans person, which we see in the media. This is a person talking about their journey, talking about significant amount of challenges which, you know, I can't experience. I can learn, I can ask the questions, we can storytell. And that has helped me get buy-in from individuals who had a perception based on what they've read, what they've been told. When they're faced with a person talking on stage about the realities of their world, it's no longer positioned in that way. So the role of storytelling is key, and helping with that education component. And particularly, again, the D&I space is significant. There's so many identities within it. But utilising that example there, I've got a lot of success of helping people understand why, you know, the whole spectrum of the LGBTQ plus space is there, and we can't be selective with our inclusion. We have all of the letters and all of it within the acronym. We can't pick and choose when we support certain identities and when we don't. If we say we are a intrinsically and holistically inclusive business, that doesn't just mean, for example, we support, you know, LGBT and we stop. No, we need to find ways and navigate what is happening on a global level, but what can we do to ensure that we deliver on what we said we would do? And that means supporting everyone within the community.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've been a bit cheeky with my last question. Well, second to last question, actually. I've actually stolen someone's challenge from the challenge wall, and I'd like to put it to you both. So this person's challenge was to keep momentum, and even when you are faced with pushback from your organisations, how do you keep going? Either of you.
Do you want to start?
You're going to stare at each other and rock, paper, scissors for it or something.
So I think in terms of keeping momentum, it's hard to keep momentum because I think you shouldn't expect if you are embedding anti-racist comms principles, if you're starting to think about inclusive marketing, you're not going to see immediate results. So you have to be in it for the long term, and you have to, if you haven't communicated or you haven't marketed to various audience groups, then you can't expect that they're going to turn around and go, oh, thanks for talking to me. Yes, I would love to support you and become your customer. Like, it's a long-term game. I would say in terms of keeping momentum, and if there's a challenge in senior buy-in, find the energy where it is in your company, in your organisation, because you will not be, I mean, look at us here, you will not be the only person in your organisation who cares about this, so you have to bring together that coalition of the willing, and there's so many resources out there that you can access. Loads of people are really generous in terms of sharing their case studies online, the processes they've gone through, and just create that network of sharing that information, and just kind of have the faith that you have to keep going with that. And you might not have got people's buy-in now, but that doesn't mean that you won't. And I do think it is a long game, and you have to be in it for the long term and recognise that it's not going to be a quick win, I would say.
I think the element from my side I think, again, when you work within the ED&I space in any sort of form, resilience and that perseverance and that, I guess, cognitive fitness that is needed to keep going. You make 2 steps forward and you go 1 step back, and that happens based on how the business is performing. We're seeing that across, from a sports perspective, across the landscape of when certain rights holders or certain agencies are no longer performing as well. Shock, which are the first teams that start to get made redundant or start to lose budget. I think bringing it back to work that I've done, when I look back at the work at Harlequins, when I first joined the business, I saw what our values were, what we had. Thankfully, that club has been going since sort of 1886 and had a number of different, I guess, verticals of how they position themselves. Commitment to the community, being bold, and I utilised those 2 components to build out how and why we should be the first club to hold rugby's first ever LGBTQ pride game. For example, what can happen in businesses, whether you lose your ally who's on the sort of senior leadership team or the business is not performing as well, you go back to the beginning of saying, this is why we did this. It comes back to the core of our identity. Are we still that business? Are we still that club? Do we still believe in these components? And the answer will be yes, because they're the foundations of the brand, the foundations of our sort of mission statement is. And they say, right, well, then let's continue that commitment. If we have to adapt and sort of adapt the model, be nimble, and still signal support in a different way, we need to. But if you've built your initiatives and you've built your advocacy on the core of what your business is or your brand is, when you do get pushback, you can revert back to, oh, I'm pretty confident this is what we say we are. So how are we going to still demonstrate that commitment and advocacy despite the fact we are not performing in the same way, or we've lost the buy-in from the senior leadership team? And when you bring it back to that, naturally, most senior leaders will go, right, okay, what is the right way forward? And I've seen that multiple times.
Yeah, and I guess it's reminding that person that gave you buy-in originally, when their distraction is somewhere else, that is the thing that they were focusing on before. And I guess, so a couple of points there to wrap up on. It's a long journey. You can't just start engaging with a new audience and expect them to change their behaviour. When you come against challenges, don't kind of stand on the ropes and throw your punches for a bit longer. But then I guess also just keep reminding the people around you what the intentions were at the beginning, and run with that. As I said on the last talk, I want everybody to walk away here with something tangible that they can go away with as well. So my last question is always going to be focused on that. As two people that have built inclusive brand guidelines, looked around kind of branding, imagery, messaging that is built purposely to be inclusive, what are kind of some real insights, some ways that you might have done that, or some real kind of tips that you can give people to go away and kind of help them address and reassess, as the kind of theme of things has been, and kind of build that type of brand image, messaging, whatever that might be? James, you're laughing. I feel like you're going to tell me that it's a long, long journey.
No, it is. I mean, I'm laughing because we spent about half an hour last night at dinner talking about brand identity and use of colour palette, which excites us when you work in the brand space and you get to use your secondary colour palette, which I get to now for the World Cup as we're building out our volunteer look and feel, and again, how we reflect on our uniform and our workforce and how we're working with suppliers to make ourselves gender inclusive. But in relation to that component of brand and identity, if I look from a Women's Rugby World Cup standpoint, we are a fixture which is here up until the tournament ends on the 27th of September. We sit within the wider universe of World Rugby. So our time in this world is quite short. But, again, as I mentioned earlier, we are very bold as one of our sort of elements within our mission statement, and what can we do to demonstrate support to the communities we know that exist. So for LGBTQ plus Pride Month, we built out a bespoke visual identity across our social channels, which linked into the brand guidelines, but were adapted to reflect the wider colour palette of the LGBTQ plus progress flag. And we just did some sort of gentle storytelling, showcasing different parts of the women's rugby community, from players to coaches to volunteers, just to show people the representation exists at all levels. And I'm doing the exact same thing right now for Black History Month. And again, looking at the different sort of black women who have paved the way throughout the history of English rugby, and also signalling to officials and volunteers who've done that work and sort of telling their stories. That's a very it's not an easy thing to do, but if you're looking at where my journey starts, that storytelling component, what you can do around key moments of the calendar to take your brand, make it bespoke for the purpose and the meaning of that month or that particular day, and then use it as a way just to give visibility to people already out there and doing the work. Usually, that's a really good first step.
Thanks. And I would say a kind of an actionable insight, if you like, or a thing to do, get comfortable with how uncomfortable it will be at times. I think that's a really good, because we're talking about what happens when you get senior challenge, or like you will get challenged. So just accept that from the beginning, and then you won't be, disappointed when it happens. Get uncomfortable, or get comfortable with how uncomfortable it might feel to look at your own where you are coming from, why you have not considered, if you haven't been looking at these issues before, well, why is that? There'll be a reason for that, and you're going to have to address that. And just also do as much learning yourself. When I was reading the challenge board earlier, quite a few people actually talked about how do you do this work in a way that's not performative. And I personally would say the way to do that is to be doing so much of that work yourself, in a way that you're not, just do it for your own learning and your own understanding and your own knowledge building, not because you're going to put it up on a social channel or you're going to share the links to it or shout about it, which I get seems like a ridiculous thing to say from someone who's holding a microphone talking about this work. But I think that's an important first step as well. So just expect it to be tricky at times, and expect that you won't know loads of things, and you're going to learn things, and lots of that learning will come with acknowledgements of previous mistakes or ways that you have got it wrong. But just take energy from, some of the things we're talking about, just take energy from the idea that it is the right thing to do, not just from a business perspective, but we know instinctively that is the, taking an inclusive approach to our marketing, our comms, that is just the right thing to do, and feel confident and comfortable in that.
Yeah, no, that's really useful, and I think hopefully speaks for a lot of people here as well. I know when I talk to people, it is that uncomfortability that is sometimes the barrier, and it is like if we're creating a barrier for ourselves, then ultimately we're kind of not getting the right output. So thank you both for your insights. Can we please have a little clap for the guys as they leave? Thank you very much.